Okay, so I'm gonna assume that we are already recording. This is part 2 to our internal controls training. And I'm just gonna go back a few slides to kind of do a brief overview. The last time for part 1, we covered essentially kind of the foundation of internal controls. We talked about the 5 components, which is control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring. And from top to bottom, there are a total of 17 principles. So starting from the top, going to the bottom, there's 5, 4, 3, 3, and 2. So there's a lot more to cover for these top 3 than there are for the bottom 3. And each principle has important characteristics called attributes. So we're going to do a deeper dive into those today. And some important key concept is internal controls provide reasonable, not absolute assurance that the entity's goals will be achieved. Management sets the objectives, implements the controls, and evaluates the system as well. And categories of those objectives can be seen here, represented by this cube of operations, reporting, and compliance. And personnel throughout the entire entity played important roles in the effective internal control system, which we'll also get into today as we touch on these sort of attributes. And this is represented on this side of the cube in various levels of the organizational structure. So, to slide 24 and kind of pick up where we left off. So we left off, actually, I think it was like on slide 28, but just to kind of backtrack a little bit, we're going to continue with control environment, which is a part of that first component that we saw earlier. And this is at the topmost level, the foundation of our control system, provides discipline and structure and influences how those objectives will be carried out. And let's just dive right into principle 1. Here we go. Okay, so principle 1, demonstrate a commitment to integrity and ethical values. So this is going to cover our attributes that contribute to the design, implementation, and operating effectiveness at the very, very top. So here we're talking about tone at the top, standards of conduct, and adherence to those standards. And you may recall that this has a lot to do with the oversight body and management demonstrating the importance of the integrity and ethical values. This is essentially a management leading by example. And when management does that, everyone else they're going to have the right attitude. They're going to want to do it as well. And the oversight body actually provides an important role in this, oversight being that they're providing oversight for management. So kind of like a checks and balances there. And it's important to note that tone at the top can be either a driver or a barrier. If you're working with management that doesn't seem to, have a great tone at the top, or they're constantly contradicting themselves, or they're not supporting other people in maintaining the control system, it really just kind of falls apart. And so that's what this is talking about here. Okay, so let's jump into standards of conduct. Okay. So management establishes the standards of conduct, and this is what is used to communicate expectations around integrity and ethical values, which is the balance between the needs and concerns of stakeholders, and those are internal stakeholders, external stakeholders. And to communicate this, management may use policies or operating principles or guidelines. And Ron, just jump in whenever.
Well, and we mostly use policies. So we've got, for us, it's the Fin 6 series, has all the different financial policies. So like there's a travel policy and there's one that talks about the hierarchy of standards and that we use in GAAP. And there's one for like food and miscellaneous expenses, and there's more that need to be developed. Like you guys worked on the lease one and the new SPIDA one, and we need to get those sent to Michael Jordan here soon so that he can sign them and get them approved. And we're missing some important ones, like we don't have an accounts payable policy, and we really need that.
Yes.
We do have an accounts receivable policy. And then Summer's working on one related to stipends and gift cards and all that sort of stuff. So part of what we need to do is we need to revisit older policies and update them, because like the lease one, it got out of date. And then new ones like the accounts payable and stipends and stuff. And there's other ones like the P card policy we've been working on here lately as to how you can use a procurement card or not use a procurement card. And then there's HR policies, and there's an overarching financial stuff like for the budget and that sort of stuff. And I think those are the Fin 2s. So we got lots of policies, but we probably need to be doing training on them, because during the pandemic, it became kind of a Wild West situation where, and we had a lot of new people. So one of the things we've heard commonly over the last year where we've been trying to enforce financial policies is, well, I've never done that before. So anyway, it's an educational process now of letting people know what policies exist and what are their boundaries that they have to work within.
That's a good point, because probably prior to COVID, it was a little bit more black and white. You know, everybody was coming into the office, and there wasn't really any gray area in terms of working from home and any flexibility around that. So even as the landscape changes, so sometimes it's not even just a revisiting of your internal control policies, may not even necessarily be due to only limited to a change in technology, but also a change in drastic economic systems, like the impact of COVID having on people having to work from home and that sort of thing. Being nimble and adaptive to that. But how do you, it's a big effort to then, as you're shifting back into the office and this a new hybrid situation, I would imagine you would have to rewrite some of those policies to accurately reflect the reality of the new workplace.
Yeah, well, and another thing that happens too is when the mayor declares a state of emergency, the policies kind of go out the window, and he takes on, or she, whoever the mayor is, takes on a lot more power than they normally have. So some of the recent emergencies we've had, the mayor will take on the power to, okay, you're a non-rep person, you normally don't get overtime, now you get overtime. Yeah. So that was part of what happened, was we were living under the pandemic state of emergency, so some of the policies just were no longer applicable because we were in a state of emergency. And we're still in a state of emergency related to housing and the homeless. So like the people working on the homeless problems, they don't have to pay attention to the financial policies. They have a lot more latitude as to what they do and how they do it. So, but the pandemic state of emergency is gone now, and we're trying to push people back into the box a little bit. And
Yeah. Makes sense. They have to adjust with the times and
Yeah.
things. Okay. So adherence to standards of conduct. So pretty much that was a great segue into the next slide. So management establishes processes to evaluate performance. So this could be ongoing monitoring or separate evaluations. This includes things like whistleblowing programs and ethics hotlines. They also determine the tolerance level for deviations from those standards. So like Ron was mentioning, there's a little bit of a different tolerance level for the houseless situation, since that's in a little bit more of a state of an emergency. And depending on the severity of the deviation, management takes appropriate action.
And we do have a whistleblower hotline through the auditor's office. And
Is that our internal auditor?
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And if you like the certified fraud examiners and stuff, I think it's every 2 years they put out a report on types of fraud and then how they were caught. And the whistleblower hotlines are probably the most effective ways of catching fraud. And that's what we would do if we encountered something that we thought was wrong. We would initially report it to the hotline, and then that would get the auditor's office involved in the process.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
It's nice to work at a place that has that.
Yep.
Okay, so principle 2, we're still under that first component. So principle 2 is exercising oversight and responsibility. So the following attributes contribute to the design, implementation, and operating effectiveness of this principle. That is oversight structure, oversight for the system itself, and input for remediation of deficiencies. So with regard to the structure, management establishes an oversight structure to fulfill its responsibilities set forth by and in compliance with laws and regulations. The entity will select the oversight body if not selected by law, and the oversight body essentially oversees the entity's operations, provides constructive criticism to management in that sort of feedback loop, and makes decisions to help achieve the objectives. So naturally, it stands to reason that they would need to understand the objectives, risks, and expectations.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of that happens through the city auditor's office here. They do performance audits, and if there's fraud suspected, they will investigate that.
Do they ever publish any of their findings?
Oh yeah.
Oh, they do.
Yeah, you can go on their website and find all of them. And they do several a year.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah.
We should take a look at this sometime.
Yeah. Well, some of them we have direct involvement with, like they have done a couple studies on procurement cards. So part of what we're doing now with procurement cards is a direct response to the findings in one of their performance audits on the P-card program.
Oh, nice. So it's an example of management taking the feedback from that oversight body and then doing something about it, changing it and making remediation.
Yeah.
Okay. So continuing with the oversight body's responsibilities, it also includes, so their responsibilities are supported by the structure that management establishes and to oversee the design, implementation, and operation of all 5 components. So input for remediation of deficiencies. So the oversight body provides input to management's plans for the remediation of deficiencies, like in this case, like Ron was talking about, for example, feedback over P cards. And management should report deficiencies to the oversight body if they become aware of any that the oversight body isn't already aware of. The oversight body is also responsible for overseeing the remediation of those deficiencies. Okay, so principle 3, establish structure, responsibility, and authority. So the following attributes contribute to this principle, and that is organizational structure, the assignment of responsibility and delegation of authority, and the documentation of internal controls. So with the organizational structure, this entails assigning responsibilities to discrete operating units, deciding how those units will interact, and establishing proper reporting lines. With the assignment of responsibility and delegation of authority, this means assigning key roles to units within those reporting lines and determining the authority needed to achieve the goals. And documentation of internal controls, this is basically the what, when, where, and why of internal control, and it's the level of documentation is a judgmental decision. The way that I've seen some of these internal controls documented tends to be either like in a narrative form or a flow chart. I've also seen like gigantic matrices. So it kind of just depends maybe on the complexity or how much detail you want to get into something. But I think I tend to see a lot in narrative form.
Well, there's a matrix and narrative for some of them, but then we've been trying to transition to flowcharts.
Oh, okay.
But because of staffing issues and pandemic and everything, that's kind of gotten put on hold. But that would be one of the things that our compliance person would work on once we hire them.
Sounds like a really cool job. Okay. So principle 4, still in that first component, is demonstrating a commitment to competence. So in order to do this, management should expect competence by hiring staff that possess relative knowledge, skills, and abilities, and that have the ability to adhere to the standards of conduct, assign responsibility and delegation of authority that management has set out. And management also needs to recruit, develop, and retain quality staff. So they can do this by finding candidates that fit the organization's needs, provide training and mentorship, provide incentives to motivate and retain staff as well. And this is something that I was hoping that you can kind of touch on or expand on a little bit more, is succession and contingency plans. So succession plans address the need to replace staff long-term. And this essentially means training the succession candidates to prepare the incoming staff. I don't know that government has a reputation for being very successful at this. And in some of my conversations across like other bureaus, they've also mentioned this as well, because there's people that have stayed in their role for so long, which is great because, hopefully that means that they love their job. But as there more and more people are retiring, there's this question of how do we retain that knowledge, because it is such specialized knowledge. And even within technical accounting, we've been doing things like videos and trying to bolster our training materials to kind of help that problem. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, so part of what we've done is trying to create a career ladder. So that's kind of why the accountant 4 positions were created. So that you could come in and do like I did and start as a 3 and work your way to the top. And that's the goal, but that hasn't always happened. There's supposedly HR is in the process of reevaluating the pay for accountants. So we may get some improvement there. I've also been working on reclassing positions to try to get people higher pay rates. And I've got a whole series of those to just kind of, the long-term goal is just kind of ratchet everybody up one to try to get better retention. But like you say, we do need to do better at documenting. But I mean, there's some issues with that because at one point we thoroughly documented everything that we did. But then we scrapped most of what we did and came up with new ways of doing it. Like the report painter thing, that was a new thing that was done 6 or 7 years ago, something like that. Which meant that everything that this team did for preparing the CAFR just went out the window, and we had to start over again. And Kevin, I think, is kind of revisiting the fund books and trying to look for a little smoother process for doing that. But each time you evolve like that, then all of your documentation goes out the window, and you got to build all new documentation. Mm-hmm. So it's a constantly evolving thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely a balance between the trade-off between it being beneficial and it costing a lot of resources.
Yeah. But for what you all do, it's critical because most of what you do once a year, and it's easy to forget how you did it and why you did it.
And it's so complex too.
And very complex.
I think recently an example where I've seen this be successful is actually on our debt team with Patty staying on a little bit longer and hiring her replacement, and she's going to be leaving, and just kind of having that overlap to make sure that things transition really, really smoothly with the new person. I think that was a pretty good idea.
Yeah, backfill has been a somewhat common thing that we've done, and probably will do again. It's like when Sheila finally decides to retire. She's been doing that job for a very, very long time, and knows it. Just going through and like I went through this process recently to reclass her position up one grade. And when you start looking at everything she does, it's just massive. Right. And the knowledge that she possesses is just massive. And so when she leaves, we probably really want to have a backfill period where she's able to work with her successor and help to train that person.
Right, sufficiently.
Yeah.
I'm sure that it's business as usual, hopefully, by the time that they actually do retire.
Yeah. Hopefully after I leave. So. But it's something we have to work on. But it's a multi-factor thing because we've got to get better pay to be competitive.
Right. To draw the talent in the door.
Yeah. So, but that's not unusual to us. I was just visiting back and forth an email this morning with one of the top finance people at TriMet, and they're experiencing the same thing. Their budget position has been vacant for a long time. They've got a couple other positions that have been vacant for a very long time, and they're not having luck hiring. And Prosper's getting ready to go through this with their head accountant leaving. And it's gonna be challenging. I don't think they're offering enough. It's basically an accountant for pay scale to do higher level work than what, because that person basically does the entire act for pretty much all by themselves. And plus a whole bunch of other stuff, so. But I've talked to CPA firms around the state and they're all having to increase their pay scales because they're not able to attract people. So anyway,
Yeah.
it's something that we have to be proactive about.
Every single aspect of it.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because along this principle 4, you still have to maintain your commitment to competence throughout it all. You know, you can't just hire like a warm body per se. You have to really hire the right people. If you're
Yeah, and it's a multi-step process. I mean, the first step is to hire exceptional people, but then you got to figure out where is the right position for that person, because they may be somebody who can really do great in one position and terrible in another position. So that's why we've never minded people moving around within the city. Is if you hire an exceptional person, that's the first step, but then you want them to find the right position for them where they can flourish. But ideally, you want to keep them within the city because we want to be filling the city up with exceptional people.
I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Because this is not limited to us. You know, all over the city, there's succession problems and.
One comment I wanted to make on this, sorry, Ron, I tried to not interrupt,
Okay.
is that it's an evolution of our world as well. And we're in a dramatic part of change in that. Like, if you look at labor statistics for women aged 25 to 34, the average tenure at a job is 2.7 years right now, but from 65 and over, it's 10 years. And if you follow that into industries, like in 2012, for local government, the average tenure was 8.1 years, and now it's 6.9 in January 22. That year loss is actually pretty dramatic if you look at the other industries and how much they've changed. And I think it has to do with that. We are seeing in general, older generations tended to stay in jobs longer than newer generations are staying in jobs. And so that to me begs a question that or points out that we're not valuing maybe properly people staying in their job, and makes me want to ask that question and dig into it a little bit.
Yeah. Well, another aspect is there's a demographic change. There's a lot less young people than there are older people, and that is giving younger people way more opportunity to advance faster and move around than existed even 20 years ago or 40 years ago. And because we kind of had, if you look at the demographics of accounting, starting around 2000, two things happened. One of them was that the dot-com thing happened, and a lot of people chose IT rather than accounting because they're somewhat similar. The second thing that happened is to be a CPA, you now had to have a master's degree. And then a lot of people looked at that and said, well, if I got to get a master's, I would just rather go into finance because that seems like it's more financially lucrative. So like I've gone to leadership sessions that OSCPA puts on, and there'll be a lot of people over 50 and a lot of people under 40. So there's that kind of bubble where way less people went into accounting. But then that's giving an opportunity for, again, for younger people to move up faster. So that may be part of why younger people are turning over, but I think it's a generational thing too. But yeah, it's something that you got to factor into it.
Very interesting. These are all really great inputs. Thank you. I love participation. Thank you both. Okay, our final but not least principle under the control environment is principle 5, enforcing accountability. So management evaluates the performance and holds individuals accountable for internal controls responsibilities. So to enforce accountability, this is again driven by tone at the top. That's probably, in my book, one of the most important things. Tone at the top is that leading by example. Also supporting day-to-day decision-making, attitudes, and behaviors, and taking corrective action as needed promptly. That's also very important. It should be timely. Other aspects in enforcing accountability is considering excessive pressures. So excessive pressure can result in personnel cutting corners to meet goals. And this can be corrected by rebalancing workloads and increasing resource levels. So that can be a little bit risky, especially in a time when you're short-staffed and under a lot of pressure to meet a deadline.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that is all the principles under control environment. Now we're going to shift over to the risk assessment aspect. So after establishing a control environment, management should assess the risks facing the entity as it seeks to achieve its objectives. So they need to assess risks from both internal and external sources. And the 4 principles we're going to be covering here are defining objectives clearly to enable identification of risks and risk tolerances, identifying, analyzing, and responding to risks, considering potential for fraud, and identifying, analyzing, and responding to significant changes. Okay. So with the first attribute, defining of objectives. So this can be done in measurable terms, allowing for the assessment of performance. It needs to be clearly defined as to what is needing to be achieved, and it should align with the organization's mission, plans, and goals. Definitions of risk tolerance. There's an acceptable level of variation in performance in relation to the achievement of the goals. And it should be defined in specific and measurable terms so that they can be clearly stated and measured consistently. Okay, so risk tolerances. These can be expressed as operations objectives, both non-financial and financial reporting objectives, and compliance objectives. That's a very difficult word for me this afternoon. Okay. So principle 7, identify, analyze, and respond to risks. So let's talk about these attributes. The identification of risks. So this is the identification and analysis of risks related to achieving the objectives and form a basis for designing a response to that risk. So this covers 2 types of risks, inherent risk and residual risk. So inherent risk is the risk to the entity in the absence of a response. So without the response, it's just the risk that is there. Residual risk is a risk that remains after the response to inherent risks. So even after you've addressed that inherent risk, there's always going to be a remaining residual risk there. The analysis of risks is used to estimate the significance, and this goes into the magnitude, likelihood, and nature of the risks. And magnitude of impact refers to the likely effect that the deficiency would have on the entity achieving its objectives. Magnitude is affected by factors such as like the size and the duration of the deficiency's impact. It's essentially measured in terms of probability and occurrence and severity of the consequences. Likelihood essentially just refers to the probability that it would happen, and nature considers the degree of subjectivity involved and whether it would arise from fraud or misconduct. So there's kind of a lot there to consider, but all these things kind of go into the analysis of identifying these risks and the responses to risks. Okay. So there's 4 different responses to risks. These are very general. So in other words, 4 different ways that management can respond to the risks that they have identified, and that is to accept, avoid, reduce, or share risk. So in acceptance of risk, there's no action. Generally, this kind of a response happens when it's just deemed to be super insignificant. We know it could happen. We're not going to do anything about it. It's fine. They're just going to accept it. Avoidance is when management decides to not partake in that action whatsoever. So action is taken to stop the process causing the risk. In other words, there's no participation in it whatsoever. We're just going to avoid it altogether. Reduction. This is when action is taken to reduce the likelihood or magnitude. So reduction, I usually think of it like diversifying your portfolio. Maybe you invest in like oil stocks and then you invest in something else that would normally move in the opposite direction in the market to kind of reduce your risk in the event that one plummets. Sharing risks is transfer or sharing risks across an entity or with external parties. So I think of this as like sometimes companies will outsource like payroll or something like that, especially if it's not in their wheelhouse, so that they can kind of focus on the things that they're most competent in and avoid taking on too much risk by doing something that they're not necessarily super experienced in. Any thoughts on that?
Wouldn't insurance be a way of sharing risk?
That's a big one.
Yeah. And there are a multitude of ways to do that. We're not really self-insured under the way it's defined in Oregon law, but a lot of our smaller claims we will just pay. But then we do have insurance policies in place to stop losses. So if the claim gets to a certain size, the insurance company takes over responsibility. So yeah.
Oh, that's fun. Oh, we may have just gone offline. Okay. All right. Yeah, thanks. I think avoidance too is, does our debt team have any sort of policies where we say that we avoid investing in any type of investments that are maybe like too risky?
We have all kinds of rules under the state law. So if we deposit money in a bank, the money has to be collateralized. So they have to basically go out and buy treasury bills or something. And sometimes it's in their name, or sometimes they'll actually do it in the government's name. And then those bonds are sitting there in case the bank goes under, then we would just take possession of those bonds and make ourselves whole. So that's one aspect. That's more in the banking. But then how can we invest money? And we can't get into equities, so we can't play in the stock market. We can basically invest in bonds. And we've got some corporate bonds, and then a lot of our bonds are like the Federal Home Loan Bank. And there are some variations on that. We call those federal agencies, but technically if you go to the Federal Home Loan Bank's website and look at the prospectus that's there, it says that they're backed by mortgages. But there's an implied thing in there that if the Federal Home Loan Bank did go under, that the federal government would step in and make everybody whole. So we kind of treat those types of investments as a federal agency, and everybody else, every other act I've read, I haven't seen a government that doesn't classify them as federal agencies, even though they're really technically not. But there's that implied insurance that the federal government will step in. And then for the corporate stuff, the city council has set up standards for what type of business we can actually buy bonds in, because like they don't want to be investing in oil companies, for instance. So there's a ESG factor in how we invest stuff. Now, I was just reading a House bill that's just been submitted, and that one is basically saying kind of two things and it's mostly related to PERS, because PERS, the state treasurer does all their investing, and they can go into equities, and they've got a lot more diversity of things that they can invest in. So what this bill is saying is, okay, you cannot use ESG as a factor in deciding where to invest. And two, if you own shares of stock, you cannot vote those shares in any way that can be construed as a political ESG type of thing. So anyway, PERS has a lot more flexibility as what they can invest in, but for us, we're very constrained to really safe investments.
So some of that avoidance is already done for us, maybe.
Yeah, because that's done by state law and the city council.
Okay. There's other factors at play there then.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay, principle 8 is still under that risk assessment component, is assessing fraud risk. So the attributes here are looking at the different types of fraud risk factors, and of course the response to that. So under types of fraud, this could be fraudulent financial reporting, misappropriation of assets, or corruption. Fraud risk factors to look out for are incentive, also known as pressure, opportunity, and attitude, also known as like rationalization. So we're going to jump right into the fraud triangle. This covers opportunity, motive, pressure, and rationalization, and gives a couple examples of each. And when you have all three, you essentially have a breeding ground for fraud. So Some things that would classify under opportunity would be a lack or circumventing of internal controls, or senior management not watching, or maybe they don't care, they're too lax, again, not having a great tone at the top. Motive and pressure can be personal financial pressure, or maybe that person deals with addiction of some sort in their life that puts pressure on them, or they have a lot of credit card debt or whatever. And then rationalization, a lot of times this is seen as the inner voice that maybe says, well, it's only fair, I haven't really received a raise, it's only a loan, I'll pay it back, they won't notice, things like that. So when you have all three, that's when you can get into this fraud triangle situation.
Yeah, gambling is one of the more common ones I've seen.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the certified fraud examiners, I don't know how they went about coming up with the numbers, but they say like 10% of people will never steal. You could just pile a bunch of money on the table and no matter what, they would never. And then 10% of people are going to steal no matter what you do. And that the other 80% is where the fraud triangle comes into play.
Oh, interesting.
That if they have the motive, rationalization, and opportunity, they will be tempted. So
Interesting.
it's critical. Now the other thing that's not pointed out here is collusion, and
Mm-hmm.
there really aren't any internal control systems that are designed to really factor that in. If you have a multitude of people that are working together to steal, there really aren't any internal control systems that are really good at doing that.
Right. So I think good internal controls helps you be reasonably assured that you can meet your objectives, not foolproof.
Yeah, like I audited a county once, and the people on the road crew just figured that part of their compensation was they could buy parts for their personal vehicles and bring them in to the county shop on the weekend and do work on their personal vehicles. But that was collusion. Just everybody in the whole department was participating. And it was a nightmare to untangle because they had a couple $100,000 worth of parts and tires and stuff in stock that couldn't be used on any county vehicle. So we worked out a deal with an auto parts shop where over time we would gradually take the parts back in, and they would give the county credit against those parts. But even the auto parts shop place didn't have the capacity to take it all at once. So.
What a mess.
Yeah.
See, in that situation, it seems like the motive or the pressure threshold was like really pretty low since everybody's kind of doing it. Doesn't seem like,
They all felt like that they're underpaid and.
Oh, that's the rationalization, sure, yeah.
And they had financial issues and.
Well, where was the management in all this? Where was that coming from?
Collusion. They were.
So that involves a management then?
Yeah, so the manager at the shop was involved in the whole thing.
That's a typical example of collusion.
That's interesting because I hadn't thought about it that way. I thought about it, and I think in my mind more commonly like colleague to colleague, coworker to coworker. But
this was everybody from the manager of the
oh,
the county road crew down to the.
I'm shocked. shook. Wow,
So,
that's fascinating.
yeah, the management team got fired and they gradually got things under control, but
Wow.
One of the things, maybe it's not very relevant to government, but there's no mention of like not easily obtainable performance expectations under motive and pressure, and that's a huge one, but I just don't know how that applies to government or if it even does. You know, like for people like in sales and stuff and all, yeah. You know, like they're like, oh, this is your goal for this month, and like they can lie about it and everything like that. So.
Oh, yeah, the pressure. Even if it's not personal financial pressure,
Right.
like just maybe it's just the pressure to keep your job or the pressure to meet a deadline or the pressure to meet, you know, some impossible sales quota or whatever. Yeah, that gets into like maybe it's not misappropriation of assets, but misrepresentation, like financial information. That's financial fraud.
yeah, and that does happen.
Okay. So that concludes the risk assessment component, and now we're into control activities. We're going to be covering 3 principles, but in the interest of time, it looks like we might only get into principle 10. The good news is there will be a 3rd training. Okay, all right, okay, guys, all right, okay, seriously, stop. It's a little embarrassing, honestly, it's too much. Okay. Control activities, okay, so the 3 principles we'll be covering under this component are the design control activities to achieve objectives and respond to risks, design information systems and related control activities to achieve those objectives and respond to risks, and management should implement control activities through policies. So I think we'll briefly touch on this last slide and then we'll wrap it up. So what goes under designing those control activities? So these attributes include, of course, the response to those objectives and risks. This can be done in the form of policies, procedures, techniques, and mechanisms that enforce management's directives to achieve objectives. Designing of appropriate types of control activities. So these could be either preventive or detective in nature, and they can be either automated or manual. And design of control activities at various levels. So for appropriate coverage of objectives and risks, and at the entity level or transaction level control activities. So just a little preview of what we'll be diving into when we start up next time. Any final thoughts before Summer? Any final thoughts?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you all for coming to this part 2, and I'm so excited to see you again for the part 3.
Oh, done.
Oh, stop.
Nice. Thank y'all. Very nice.
Great job again, Cynthia.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I just,
thank you.
wish I could stop recording.
There you go.
Yes, please stop.